So thank you so much for joining us today at our 7th annual Electoral Reform Symposium. I want to go ahead and kick it off with our first speaker of the day. We have Ms. Amber McReynolds, and she is the Executive Director of Vote at Home. So Amber, come on in, come on down. Welcome.
Okay, well, hi, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you.
Yeah.
And we're good on the mic, so
Good.
great. I took the liberty of printing out your bio.
Oh, thanks.
I got to meet you yesterday at the Nonpartisan Reformers Summit at
Yeah.
Oxford Hotel. That was a really neat event.
Yeah, it was really great, wasn't it?
Yes, to
was a
see
really good
Nanner,
discussion.
Jim Jonas and all of them put that together. Rob Ritchie of Fair Vote, Cynthia, they invited me to be there as a guest for Fair Vote, and I'm like, let's do this.
Yep.
And so it was really nice to be part of that and see and learn from the panels and your discussions. And we even had a gathering of women in politics.
Yep. Women in political innovation.
I know, that's great.
Yeah, it was really great.
Amber, Vote at Home system. Can you let people know you're a mother of two?
Yep.
I think that's pretty sweet.
Yep, and they're here.
And they're here. And you're doing so much. It's difficult enough for women in this arena to be doing what we're doing. And women with children is even more challenging, as we discussed at the summit yesterday. What are you doing with Vote at Home? What's your background? Let people that have no idea who you are, what you're about.
Well, so I was the director of elections in Denver for about 7 years. I ran elections in the city for close to 14 years. And when I first started in the election office, I was about 26 years old, had just come off of another policy job. And in the interview, the person that would actually become my boss said, "Aren't you a little young to be applying for this job?" And that question alone sort of told me pretty much everything I needed to know about the office I was going to go into. And sure enough, getting there, I found sort of a mentality that everything had been done a certain way for 30 years or 40 years, and there was a lot of resistance to change, and there wasn't really a culture of customer service and innovation and how to better serve the voting populace. And so I started to kind of make incremental changes in the coordinator job that I was in, and then ended up getting promoted to a manager job after Denver had some issues in one of the elections in 2006, and a lot of people left or were sort of encouraged to leave after some of that. And the one area that worked well in that election was the vote by mail area, and that was the part that I was responsible for. And so I started sort of moving up and became deputy director by 2008. And that's when we really started to change the organization for the better, innovate on technology, better serve customers, and really it catapulted Denver to being now one of the best election offices in the country. We've developed first in the nation technology around ballot tracking, an e-sign petition application. It was the first digital petition application in the country. So Denver has really led on, not only technical innovation, but also policy innovation. And then back in 2013, I was able to help the legislature write new legislation that became now the Colorado voting model, which includes automatic registration, same-day registration, vote centers, as well as automatic ballot delivery out to every voter prior to every election.
Thank you. It's inspiring to be around an individual that has as much, even maybe more passion than I don't know, definitely in electoral reform. Yeah. And I was hearing a lot about the successes you've had and how the vote at mail system really engages and inspires individuals to vote, makes it easier, comes home. I definitely have some questions for you, but I'd like you to do your PowerPoint, and I want to make sure I have time for audience questions. That's important, more important than the questions for me, to have the audience involved for discussion as well. So
absolutely.
Thank you, Amber, and I'm sure your children are very proud to have a mother like you. You're a very inspirational woman.
Oh, so. Thanks. Yeah, they've come to lots of speeches, so they've heard this more than anybody. Well, yeah, so as I mentioned, like back in 2005 when I started at the elections office, there wasn't a customer-focused kind of culture. And so I sort of kicked off this whole idea of putting voters first in everything that we do, whether it's policy reform or any of that, because when we look over our history of elections in this country, even going back to women's suffrage, which I also just authored a book that's going to come out soon that goes back to women's suffrage and takes a look at that. Even when we go all the way back, our system was not designed to put voters first. It was designed for the political parties or for the candidates and all of that. So the whole idea here is really to put voters first and put them at the center of the process, meet them where they are in their everyday lives. So, see if this advances. Oh. Okay, I might need help advancing. Okay, so the one concept that I often talk about is that we need to sort of reverse our thinking about how election policies and how elections are actually run, and we need to get the partisanship out of it. So I always say that we need to, election policy and administration needs to be about who votes, not who wins. And traditionally, it's sort of the focus is always on kind of the outcomes as opposed to who's actually participating in the process and how to make their voting process better. So we can go ahead and advance. And there's a couple realities. 2016, there was only about 61% of the voting eligible population that actually participated in the election. So we had 80 million people that did not vote. That was a larger number in 2018 because we only had 50% of the population vote. And what's interesting about that is Pew did an analysis after both elections and asked voters why they didn't vote. And about 41% after the 2018 election indicated inconvenience was the reason. So not that they were disengaged, not that it was not something they wanted to do, but truly just purely inconvenience. So we really have, I think, an opportunity to, with vote-at-home systems and convenience voting, to encourage these folks that did not vote and pretty much capture a lot of them that didn't vote just by purely making the process easier. So if we want to go ahead forward, we have a little video that we'll play here, and this is really about the vote-at-home system, which I think gives a good high-level view of it. Get play.
This is Anna. She lives in a state that has barriers making it difficult to vote anywhere other than on election day, in person, and at a single government-specified polling place, which makes voting difficult. Last year, Anna's city proposed a ballot measure that she was very passionate about voting for. But on election day, Anna arrived at her assigned polling place and found a long line of people waiting to cast their vote. She tried to wait, but ran out of time and had to leave the voting center to pick up her son from school. As a result, Anna's voice was not heard. In 2016, only 6 out of 10 eligible voters cast their vote. In 2018, that number got even worse. Of the people who did not vote, more than 40% pointed to various barriers, from work conflicts, overly busy schedules, illnesses or disabilities, to transportation as reasons they were unable to cast their vote. Fortunately, there is a time-tested and proven way to overcome these barriers and improve voter engagement, ensure the election is secure, streamline the administrative process, increase trust, and strengthen our democracy. That solution is vote at home. Vote-at-home systems empower voters, letting them decide when, where, and how they vote. How does it work? With Vote-at-Home, active registered voters get their ballot delivered to them automatically weeks before Election Day, fill it out at their convenience, then return it either in person or by mail. There's no need to take time off work, stand in line at a polling place, fight traffic and bad weather, or feel rushed at making important voting decisions. This is Becca. She lives in a state with a vote-at-home system, where her ballot was mailed right to her door. While waiting to pick up hers from school, Becca was able to fill out her ballot and drop it off at a secure drop box on the way home, well before Election Day. She was even able to track her ballot to make sure her vote was counted. With the vote-at-home system, voter engagement increases and our democracy is strengthened, all while improving the voting experience and access for all. We need a convenient voting process that puts voters first. We need to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to vote. It is, after all, our democracy.
Okay, so that's kind of gives the high level view of it. We can go to the next slide. And this is the analogy I like to use. So There's always a lot of intense focus on registering voters, and sort of there's a lot of investment. That's where a lot of the money goes in terms of donor engagement in the nonprofit community. And by only streamlining the registration process or making that easier and not sort of following it through the complete voter transaction, we sort of keep people where they are in the current process, which doesn't necessarily work for them. So I sort of always say this, but like it'd be like Amazon streamlining and modernizing the sign up and the kind of account management and the purchasing process, but making you go pick up your packages at an assigned distribution center and waiting in line to pick up your actual product, right? So the whole idea here is that we streamline registration and then automate the balloting process as well. And it shows up for voters. They don't have to guess as to what day the election is or when they have to request an absentee ballot. And we've seen a lot of advantages. So we'll go through the next slide here. The current status of vote at home in the country is a mostly Western phenomenon. The Pacific Coast actually for the first time in 2020 will prepay postage on every single voter that will receive a mail ballot in the mail. More than half of California voters will get their ballot mailed to them at home next year, which is a first. Hawaii passed legislation this year. We also did some work in Pennsylvania and New York. We will have a bill in Virginia coming soon, and there's been a couple of other expansions, including Nevada. But it is definitely more prominent on the western side of the United States. So we go forward. The one thing I also wanted to share is this is from Nonprofit Vote, and the top 10 states for turnout in 2018 all had commonalities with regards to policies. So it's a combination usually of same-day registration. All the top 4 states have that. Vote at home, all 3 of the vote at home states were in the top 10 for turnout. And then any of that other registration modernization that helps. So if we go forward. The other thing is this is the only sort of method of voting that has been on the rise. We've seen a pretty significant decline in polling place voting and election day voting since 1992, and vote by mail has continuously gone up. Early voting has kind of goes up and down depending on the presidential process. So go forward. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is vote at home systems significantly help with the disability gap. So one of the things with the Help America Vote Act that we did is we invested heavily in making polling places accessible. But what we failed to recognize is that the biggest gap that a lot of voters have is transportation to get to the spot. So the vote at home states, they're all in the green dots towards the right, they actually close the gap significantly for disability voters and voters with disabilities and accessible issues. So by closing that transportation gap, we can also help a lot of those voters with better processes. Let's go forward. So this is kind of the progress in 2000, kind of from 2016 till now. You can see in the green there's been a significant amount of policy work done in various states. And then right now, there's a few states that are actually proposing to make some changes prior to 2020. Alaska has a bill on the table that we're working on. We're working in Virginia right now. Washington, D.C., Maryland, Connecticut, and Maine are all contemplating expansions of vote by mail, which is really great. Go forward. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is the other kind of vote at home conversation that's happening is filling the gap for military voters as well as blind voters that might have that transportation gap, and maybe that paper ballot that shows up to them is not accessible for them. And we also know that our military voters, the 45-day window for mailing and all of that overseas is often not enough for them to get their ballot back in a secure way. And we also know that attaching documents to emails is not necessarily a good secure method for returning a ballot back to us. So there's a project that's also happening that we've been tracking, pilot projects happening across the country, and it's really about those 2 communities that often get left out of the process. So there's a few cities and states that have done this. So this is something else we're kind of monitoring as we go forward. So if you want to go to the next slide. And then these are just resources. Our website is voteathome.org. We have a ton of research, a ton of kind of news stories. We have a research library, a policy research guide. And this is really all of our information for anyone that is watching at home or wants to follow some of the work that we do. You can sign up for our newsletter and our communications, and we share what's going on across the country. So that's really what I had today to share, and happy to answer questions. So.
Wonderful. I would say thank you for that. Reading information here, I feel it's really important for we see the trend of how it engages people, more voting, where we have vote at mail, which is great. And I feel it's secure and efficient, right? That's what I'm reading in the information here.
Yeah, so the other piece of this, which I didn't cover in the presentation, is the significant cost savings. So
that was my next question.
Right after Colorado implemented, Pew actually did an analysis statewide of Colorado's election kind of administration costs and found a 40% savings for counties across the state, big, large, medium, small counties. And the other really big savings that is the most significant is in equipment. So Colorado actually, with this footprint, you don't have to have as many voting machines and you don't have to have all that infrastructure and people out at managing a lot of polling places. So there's not as much need for all of the equipment that we used to have. So when Colorado went to a new voting system, the system as a whole cost the state $20 million across all 64 counties. And that would have been about $150 million had we not gone to this system. So when we see states like Georgia and Pennsylvania implementing these massive new voting systems and spending $100 million plus, if they went to something more like this, they would actually reduce their capital equipment footprint and save their taxpayers a lot of money, even though they're serving their more customers in a more efficient way.
I mean, it's reduced by over 80%, 90%?
Yep. Close to, yeah.
I wanted to really dial in and get an idea of what your strategy is for implementing vote at home throughout the United States.
Yeah, well, it is a state-by-state conversation. So yes, and what's interesting, the map, kind of the current map, looks a lot like women's suffrage did as of 1920. Wow. So women, when women got the right to vote, it was sort of a Western thing first. And what's interesting is a lot of the same states that have done this first are those same states that passed women's suffrage first, which is interesting. But it definitely is something that we're seeing grow across the country. There's a lot of interest at the state legislative level. We were tracking between 20 and 25 different bills in 2019 alone. And so our strategy is really about helping states not only just pass reform, but get the reform right. So we want to make sure those protections are in place for voters, like ballot tracking, like good auditing, good instructions, good ballot design. We want to make sure all those elements are covered in the legislation. And so our research and policy guide covers a lot of those best practices. We want to make sure that states get it right up front and not kind of be sued on the back end for not doing it correctly, right? So our goal is really policy design, advocacy, and implementation to make sure it's done right and done in a good way.
Well, our goal through the United We Stand tour and the final stop presenting the presidential debate and the launch of the blockchain app is to really inspire, engage people, individuals, the youth, younger generations, everyone to run for office.
Yep.
DR, third party, independent. And on that app, I would love, and I foresee, not only individuals that are supporting and candidates that can go on to it, but the individuals running for office to learn more about vote at home.
Yeah.
And to be inspired to consider implementing that and supporting your efforts.
Yeah, it'd be really great.
And it's beautiful.
And I think the other thing is voters can organically choose this. In most states, they can sign up for an absentee ballot if they want to. And they can kind of organically grow and sort of push the policy, which is similar to what happened in a lot of the western states. Here in Colorado, we're up to about 70% of voters actually asking for their ballot to be mailed to them before we went and implemented the full system. So voters can kind of engage and push this along to policymakers on their own in most states.
And you said it currently has in Colorado, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Hawaii.
Yep, Hawaii just passed, and then California is about halfway.
And then the absentee, reading here, to really get in, the process says it usually starts with a move from excuse required absentee ballots, that is, to no excuse. So that's kind of a nice in there.
Yeah.
It's a smart strategy.
It's the incrementalism. I mean, there's still states like West Virginia, Missouri, that still require an excuse. You have to have a doctor's note to get an absentee ballot mailed to you, or a note from your employer that you're going to be out of the jurisdiction. So in Texas, if you're over 65, you don't have to provide an excuse, but if you're 64 and a half, you do have to provide an excuse. So there's kind of a lot of silly policies that still exist in certain states that we also want to try to improve.
Okay, well, I could keep asking more questions, but I want to open up to the audience, let them have a voice here. So does anybody have a question? I want to give them a chance at least. We have one in the back, so should we have them come up? Is there a microphone or for audience questions?
No, it's okay, just have them speak up.
Oh, okay.
I'll keep our mic back there.
So you can speak up if you want.
Okay, yeah. So there's recently in the past couple of decades been like a big astroturf movement to, against fake voting and that kind of thing, like people like go and vote for like their dead relatives or that kind of thing. It's been like kind of a big scaremongering thing about that. And so that's really been hurting democracy and voters, because there's been like now you need like a photo ID in some states, and now you need to do a whole bunch of things to vote in some states. And how can we help people who have kind of fallen for this myth to realize that things like this are more important than a couple hundred people putting in fake ballots? That getting thousands and thousands of people who haven't previously been able to vote the opportunity to vote is more important. How do we go about convincing them?
Amber, could you repeat the question for our
Yeah,
online audience?
yeah. So the question was really how can we make sure that the system is secure, and there's a lot of rumors about fraud and voters voting other people's ballots and things like that. And so how do we build a system that makes sure that that happens and balances out security? So a couple things I would say on that. First off, elections, and this is sort of the acronym I always used when I was running elections in the process, but they have to be fair, accessible, secure, transparent, efficient, and reliable. And I say that faster. They have to be faster elections. And all of those values matter equally. So some people will say, well, security is kind of the top priority. And the thing about it is when you're running and actually administering an election, all of those values matter equally. So what I believe about this system is that we've essentially balanced all those values. And when we say that the policies have to be designed right, we mean that every element of that process kind of ties in together. So it isn't just implementing vote by mail, it's also implementing list maintenance and automatic address updates and automatic registration to make sure that the voter registration addresses are accurate and that we know where people are, because with this model we have to have accurate address data, right? So the registration aspects and sort of making that process efficient so that we have accurate information is really important. And so they kind of, they're intricately tied together, similar to the Amazon analogy. So we've had to, in Colorado as well as the other states that have implemented this, improve our processes around registering to vote, getting accurate information, and all of that up front so that we get the ballot to the right person efficiently. And we don't get ballots out to people that have moved away and what have you. So in Colorado, as an example, we, as part of our legislation, we automatically consume data from the National Change of Address database as well as other government sources, and we automatically update address records. We don't need another piece of paper from you. We don't need to send you a mailer. We automatically move you to the new location, and if you move out of state, we don't send a ballot. We actually send you a notice and say, we understand you've moved out of the state. Here's your new state information. You need to register to vote there. So that proactivity around the process up front really matters. And then the back end, of course, when the ballot comes back, we do signature verification. We have a whole training regime in Colorado as well as the other states that have implemented this to make sure that election judges do that process correctly. If the signature doesn't match, the voter has to cure that, and there's a process to cure that. Fairly small percentage, but still that's a protection in place to make sure that we get the right information and the right ballot from each person. So.
Well, wonderful. I do have one question. I've experienced almost always positive with the vote at home ballots. But there was one incident where I'm wondering what your question would be, answer would be on this. In 2010, free and equal elections. Myself, the team, we led the national efforts against the top 2 primary, Prop 14 in California, which was a big topic at the summit yesterday.
Yes.
I didn't speak this year, maybe next year.
Yep.
I'd be happy to open up that conversation. What I learned is that the proponents in support of Top 2 actually launched a multi-million-dollar, maybe more of like a mail-in ballot campaign. And while it's great to have voter engagement, and they had more voters involved, hundreds of thousands more vote that year, it was so far before the election, well, a good month or so. At that time, voters were 70% in support of Top 2 because they were told it was one thing, when in fact I felt it was another. Days before the election, voters came out 70% against, but we were unable to overcome that mail-in ballot. So it's kind of the catch-22. It's a great thing,
Right.
but as they became more informed, the voter turnout was so against it, and it barely passed by like 1 or 2%.
Yeah, I think so. I think sending the ballots too early is a problem, and I think
Yes.
sending them too late is a problem, right? So it's figuring out the sweet spot of when is the right point, and making sure it's consistent statewide. So we were very particular about that in Colorado. We basically said we want a window, and all counties have to mail within this 5-day period, and so it's about 3 weeks prior to the election, because we felt that by that point, people kind of knew, most of the issues. The Blue Book was already out, all of that, so voters kind of had, they'd have the 3 weeks to decide. And the other interesting thing that we're seeing in Colorado, and this could be because we're a swing state versus California that's not, is we see this huge rush the last weekend of voters turning in their ballots. So people aren't necessarily turning them in at the 3-week period. They're waiting until closer to election day. And so I think like that window of when you mail really matters. And for me, I think that 3-week period is a
That's
good
better.
sweet spot.
And also who's funding it, the mail-in ballot campaign, if it's more of a private or independent entity?
Yeah, so the campaigns can kind of push that as they
Yes.
want to and encourage people to sign up that way depending on the state they're in. So.
But overall, this is a great cause. So thank you so much,
Yep,
Amber.
thank you.
It's so
Thanks
nice
for
to
having
have
me.
you.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Amber McReynolds of the Vote at Home system. So
Thank you.
Thank you for coming with your kids today.
Yeah,
It's great
thank
to
you.
have them.